I always knew I was second best. Some children grow up feeling cherished, as if they are the center of their parents' world. I was not one of those children. In my house, there was only room for one star, and that was Olivia, my older sister. My parents' pride and joy, their golden child, and me, I was just an extra expense. It was never outright cruelty, never something I could point to and say this is why I knew they didn't love me as much. It was in the small things, the way they fussed over Olivia's needs while brushing mine aside, the way my mother's eyes lit up when Olivia walked into a room but barely flickered when I did the same, the way my father praised Olivia's every achievement, but when I accomplished something, he would nod absently before moving on to something else. I learned young that in our house, Olivia mattered and I did not. We weren't a rich family, not by any means. My parents worked hard just to keep a roof over our heads, but no matter how tight things were, they always found a way to give Olivia everything she wanted. She had the best clothes, the newest shoes, and when she expressed the slightest interest in dance, they somehow scraped together enough money for lessons, costumes, and competitions. When I asked for a simple art set for my birthday, I was told it was too expensive. At first, I didn't mind. Olivia was older, and maybe it was natural that they wanted to give her more opportunities. But as I grew up, the imbalance became impossible to ignore. I worked harder than anyone else at school, spending late nights studying while Olivia breezed by with average grades. When I brought home my first report card filled with straight A's, I had expected some form of recognition. Maybe not a parade, but at least a proud smile. Instead, my mother barely looked up from her bills. "That's nice, Emma," she murmured. "Nice." The next day, Olivia announced she had been accepted into a local modeling agency. My parents threw her a party. The final blow came when Olivia started dating Ryan. Ryan was everything my parents had ever dreamed of, wealthy, successful, and from an influential family. The moment he entered Olivia's life, it was as if he had entered all of our lives. My parents treated him like royalty. My father started calling him son within a month of meeting him, and my mother practically tripped over herself to make him feel at home. The obsession was instant, and it was suffocating. Ryan took Olivia to lavish restaurants, gifted her designer jewelry, and promised to take care of her. My parents clung to him as if he were their last hope, their golden ticket out of the struggle they had lived with for so long. It was then that I started to disappear completely. They stopped paying attention to me altogether, too consumed with Olivia's future as Ryan's wife. It was all they talked about, all they cared about, the wedding, the house Ryan was buying for Olivia, the vacations they would take, the life they would all live thanks to Olivia's perfect choice in men. I was an afterthought. Until one night when I overheard them talking. I had come downstairs for a glass of water, my footsteps light as I walked toward the kitchen. But then I heard my mother's voice, sharp and serious in the quiet house. "We need to focus on Olivia's wedding," she was saying. "It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for this family." "What about Emma?" my father asked, though he didn't sound too concerned. "She's a distraction," my mother replied without hesitation. "We don't have the money to waste on her." Waste. That was when I knew. I still remember the day they told me I was leaving. The morning air was crisp, a cool breeze drifting in through the open window as I sat at the kitchen table. The scent of fresh-baked bread filled the house, but it did nothing to soothe the knot in my stomach. My mother stood by the counter pouring herself a cup of tea, her movements precise, calculated. My father sat across from me, his fingers tapping idly against the wooden surface. Olivia was in the living room, humming softly as she flipped through a bridal magazine. Everything felt so normal, except for the fact that I could feel something was coming. "We need to talk," my father said finally, his voice heavy. I swallowed hard. Those words had never meant anything good in this house. My mother set her cup down and folded her hands in front of her. "Your Aunt Margaret has agreed to take you in." The words hit me like a slap. I blinked, certain I had misheard. My father cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. "It's for your own good, Emma." "For my own good?" I let out a breathless laugh, but there was nothing funny about it. "You're sending me away?" My mother exhaled sharply, already impatient with my reaction. "This isn't a punishment," she said, as if that somehow made it better. "Your aunt lives in a bigger city. There are more opportunities for you there." "Opportunities?" I repeated, numb. "And what if I don't want to go?" My father frowned, as if the idea of me refusing had never even crossed his mind. "Emma, this isn't up for discussion." I turned to Olivia, desperate for some sort of support, some sign that she didn't want me gone. "Say something." She barely glanced up from her magazine. "What do you want me to say? That this is insane? That they can't just send me away like I don't matter?" Olivia sighed, flipping a page lazily. You're making this dramatic. It's not like they're kicking you out onto the streets. Aunt Margaret's nice enough. Nice enough? Like I was being packed up and shipped off to summer camp, not being discarded so they could focus on Olivia's perfect little wedding. The realization settled over me like a thick, suffocating fog. This wasn't about opportunities. This wasn't about what was best for me. This was about them. It had always been about them. They had found their golden ticket in Ryan, and I was nothing more than an inconvenience standing in the way of their fantasy life. I had always known I wasn't their priority, but I had never realized I was disposable. I can get a job, I said, my voice shaking now. I'll help with the wedding expenses. I won't be a burden. You already are, my mother interrupted, her tone sharp. Everything inside me froze. She didn't even look guilty. She meant it. And for the first time, I truly saw them for what they were. They didn't love me. Not really. Love wasn't something you could throw away when it became inconvenient. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor, but I wasn't even sure where I was going. There was nowhere to go. Nowhere that was mine. When? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My father shifted uncomfortably. Tomorrow. Tomorrow. They had already decided. This wasn't a conversation. It was a sentence. I turned on my heel and stormed upstairs, ignoring my mother's exasperated sigh. She didn't care that I was upset. She just wanted me to leave quietly. I slammed the door to my bedroom and pressed my back against it, my heart pounding. My gaze landed on the suitcase sitting at the foot of my bed. They had already packed for me. I spent the night staring at the ceiling, willing myself to wake up from this nightmare. But morning came, and nothing had changed. They had my bag waiting by the door. My mother kissed Olivia on the cheek, whispering something about dress fittings, and Olivia beamed. My father checked his watch, already eager to be done with this. Not a single one of them looked at me. Not even when I picked up my suitcase. Not even when I stepped out the door. Aunt Margaret's car idled in the driveway, her expression unreadable as she waited for me. I turned one last time, hoping, praying, begging for some kind of sign that they cared. That maybe, just maybe, this hurt them too. But they were already moving on. My mother fussed over Olivia's hair. My father scrolled through his phone. Olivia laughed at something on her screen, like I wasn't even there, like I had never been there. And that's when I knew. They had already erased me. I swallowed down the lump in my throat, turned away, and got into the car. I didn't look back. And they didn't either. I had been thrown away, and for the first time, I realized something terrifying. I was completely alone. Starting over was brutal. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion of juggling jobs, scraping together enough money to pay my expenses, or studying late into the night with barely enough energy to keep my eyes open. It was the loneliness. The crushing realization that the people who were supposed to love me, the ones who were supposed to fight for me, had thrown me away like I was nothing. I spent the first few months wondering if they ever thought about me, if they ever regretted their decision, if they even noticed I was gone. But the calls never came. Not once. And that's when I knew I was truly on my own. Aunt Margaret did what she could, but she was a retired school teacher living on a pension. She had a good heart, but not a lot of money. I refused to be a burden, so I took any job I could find. Mornings, I worked at a bakery. I woke before the sun rose, kneading dough, inhaling the scent of fresh bread while my hands cracked from the constant exposure to flour and heat. Afternoons, I attended college classes. I sat in the back, exhausted, struggling to keep up, but I refused to fall behind. I wasn't just there to get a degree. I was there to prove to myself that I was worth something. Evenings, I waited tables at a small diner. I smiled at customers who barely acknowledged me, cleaned up after people who left messes without a second thought, and walked home with aching feet, counting my tips and hoping they'd be enough to cover groceries. Some nights, I skipped meals. Some weeks, I wondered if I'd make it through. But no matter how hard it got, I never once thought about crawling back to them. They had made their choice, and so had I. I met Noah on one of those late nights at the bookstore where I worked part-time between my other jobs. He was one of those customers who never seemed to actually buy anything. Instead, he spent hours flipping through business books, taking notes in a worn-out notebook, and looking like a guy with 1,000 ideas and no plan to make them happen. One night, while I was closing up, he looked up at me and asked, "Do you ever think about doing something bigger?" I snorted, shoving books onto the shelf. I barely have time to think about anything but. Noah was persistent. I'm serious, he said, leaning against the counter. You're smart. I've seen the way you organize things here, the way you handle people. You could do more than this. I almost laughed in his face, but there was something in his eyes, something familiar. The same hunger I had. The same desperation to prove that we weren't just struggling nobodies doomed to scrape by forever. That night, we talked until the bookstore owner kicked us out. By the next week, we were meeting up after our shifts, brainstorming ideas, sketching out plans on napkins, dreaming about things that felt impossible. Until one night, over cheap takeout in Aunt Margaret's tiny kitchen, we decided to stop dreaming and start doing. We were going to start a business. We had no idea what we were doing, but we were going to try anyway. It was a disaster at first. We failed over and over again. We started with a small online service, helping students with resume writing and job applications. The idea was solid, but no one took us seriously. We moved on to freelance consulting, offering business strategies to startups, even though we barely had experience ourselves. Most people ignored us. We worked out of coffee shops, borrowing Wi-Fi, living off cheap black coffee, sending out pitch emails at 2 in the morning, hoping someone, anyone, would give us a chance. No one did. Not at first. I remember the night we nearly quit. We had $47 left between the two of us. Noah sat across from me at our favorite cheap diner, staring at his half-eaten burger. Maybe we should just get normal jobs, he muttered. And for the first time, I almost agreed. I was exhausted. I had been working nonstop, sacrificing sleep, eating garbage food, stretching every last penny for what? But something inside me refused to let go. I had been discarded before. I had been seen as worthless before. I wasn't going to let that happen again. So instead of agreeing, I looked Noah in the eye and said, "No, we're not quitting. We're going to figure this out." And we did. It didn't happen overnight, but we kept pushing. We refined our skills, learned from our failures, adjusted our strategy. Then one day, it happened. We landed our first real client, a small business took a chance on us. Then another, and another. The late nights, the endless rejection, the brutal struggle, it all started paying off. Within a year, we weren't just surviving anymore. We were thriving. Investors took notice. People started talking about us. We became something. I watched as our tiny, struggling startup turned into something bigger, something real. And for the first time in my life, I had something that was truly mine. Something no one could take away. As our business grew, my life changed. I moved out of Aunt Margaret's apartment and into a place of my own. I traveled for work, met people who actually saw me as a person, not a burden. And the most shocking part? I was happy. Without them. Without my parents. Without Olivia. I had spent so much of my life believing I needed their approval. That if I worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, they would finally see me. But now I understood the truth. They never would have. And I didn't need them to. Because I had built a life without them. A life so much bigger than anything they could have imagined. And soon, they were going to find out just how much they had lost. There was a time when I thought I would never escape the shadow of my family. When I believed that no matter how hard I worked, I would always be the forgotten one, the castaway. But I was wrong. What started as a desperate attempt to survive, a tiny startup with nothing but determination and sleepless nights, grew into something unstoppable. Noah and I didn't just build a business. We built a legacy. At first, our growth was slow, steady but unspectacular. We invested every dollar wisely, poured every ounce of our energy into making the company bigger, smarter, stronger. While other businesses took reckless risks, we made strategic moves. I studied finance, technology, and business strategy like my life depended on it, because, in a way, it did. I refused to be ignorant. I learned how to negotiate, how to recognize a bad deal before it even reached the table. Every weakness I had once been shamed for, I turned into a strength. And then it happened. One deal, one game-changing investment. We landed a partnership with a major corporation. A company that had the resources we needed to scale beyond our wildest dreams. In a matter of months, we went from a small, respectable business to one of the fastest-growing brands in the market. Our name was everywhere. Noah and I were invited to exclusive networking events, recognized as rising stars in the business world. People who had once ignored us were now desperate to be in our orbit. We had built something extraordinary. And then one night, I saw the news. At first, I thought I had misread the headline. Ryan Carter's business faces financial ruin. I clicked on the article, my heart pounding, not out of fear, not out of concern, but out of something colder, something sharper. Curiosity. I read through every line, absorbing every detail. Years of reckless spending, poor investments, and arrogance had finally caught up with him. His empire was crumbling. The very man my parents had sacrificed me for was losing everything. And my parents? They had built their entire dream life on Ryan's wealth. They had never saved a cent, never considered what might happen if their golden ticket failed. Now, they were scrambling. No money. No security. No way out. It was poetic. I closed my laptop and sat in silence for a long moment. I should have felt something, shouldn't I? Regret? Pity? But all I felt was a slow, calculated sense of justice. For years, they had treated me like I was nothing. They threw me away without a second thought. And now, I was the one with the power. I had a choice to make, and I already knew what I was going to do. I picked up my phone and called Noah. I want to buy Ryan's company. There was a pause, then a low, amused chuckle. I thought you might say that. Acquiring Ryan's business wasn't difficult. He was drowning in debt, desperate for a bailout. He had no idea that the company he had built was about to land in my hands. At the final negotiation meeting, he walked in looking exhausted, defeated. For a moment, he almost looked like the man I remembered. The man my parents worshipped. The man they believed was untouchable. But now? Now he was nothing, and I was the one sitting on the other side of the table, completely in control. He had no idea. Not yet. He went through the usual routine, talking about investment opportunities, the restructuring he was planning, the ways his company could bounce back with the right funding. And then I said it. I'm not investing, Ryan. I'm buying. He blinked. What? I leaned forward, my voice even. I own your debt. I own your company. I own everything. It took him a second to process my words. Then the color drained from his face. This isn't possible, he whispered. I smiled. Oh, it's very possible. His hands clenched. Who the hell are you? I tilted my head. You don't recognize me? And that was the moment. That was the exact second he realized. His mouth parted slightly. His hands gripped the table as if he could steady himself. I saw it all. The shock. The confusion. The horror. Emma, he breathed. I didn't reply. I didn't have to. For the first time in my life, I had the upper hand. I had worked for this, earned this, and I wasn't going to waste a second of it. Ryan's panic was instant. He started bargaining, pleading. I can fix this, he said, voice shaking. We can work together, Emma. We can turn this company around. I laughed softly. I don't need to turn it around. I already own it. His breathing was uneven. He looked like he was on the verge of begging. Please, he whispered. I remembered the way my parents used to talk about him. How they would gush about how perfect he was. How they would smile as they shipped me off, treating me like a problem they were finally rid of. They had handed Olivia everything, and now they had nothing. And I? I had everything. For a long moment, I just stared at him. I could crush him completely. I could take everything he had left, leave him with nothing, just like they had left me. But I didn't care enough to destroy him. He wasn't worth it. So I stood up, sliding the final contract across the table. You'll keep 20% of the company, I said, voice cold and precise. Enough to survive. Enough to watch what I do with it. He swallowed. And the rest? I smiled. It's mine. They had forgotten about me for years. I had been nothing more than a shadow, a discarded afterthought in their carefully curated lives. But now? Now I was everywhere. My name was splashed across business reports, financial magazines, and corporate news. Emma, the investor who had saved a struggling empire. The woman who had turned an unstable corporation into a powerhouse. Despite everything, Ryan and Olivia still held on to their pride. They thought they were above everyone else. They convinced themselves that even after losing their wealth, they were still part of an exclusive world. A world of elegance, power, and untouchable status. So when an invitation arrived for one of the most exclusive weddings of the year, they accepted without hesitation. The envelope was crisp, white, thick with golden embossed lettering. No names were listed on the sender card. Just a simple phrase. A union of power and legacy. Ryan saw it as an opportunity. A chance to rub elbows with high society again. Maybe even an opportunity to network, to rebuild what he had lost. Olivia was ecstatic. She had always loved glamorous events, and even though she had lost her luxurious life, she still believed she belonged among the elite. They had no idea what was waiting for them. The venue was breathtaking, an estate overlooking the ocean, lit up in golden hues as the sun set over the horizon. Expensive floral arrangements lined the entrance. Luxury cars parked in neat rows. Guests arrived in designer gowns and tailored suits, sipping on champagne as they whispered about the mysterious couple at the center of it all. Ryan straightened his jacket as he and Olivia stepped through the grand entrance, their eyes scanning the lavish setting. "This is incredible," Olivia murmured, looping her arm through his. "Who do you think it is?" Ryan smirked. "Someone important." They moved further inside, admiring the decor, greeting people they hadn't seen in years. For a brief moment, they felt like they belonged again. And then the music shifted. Guests turned toward the grand staircase at the center of the estate. And that's when they saw me. I stood at the top of the staircase, wearing a gown that shimmered like liquid gold under the soft lighting. I watched as Ryan's eyes widened, his face draining of color. Olivia gripped his arm, her breath catching in her throat. "No," she whispered. "It can't be." But it was. I descended the stairs with deliberate, graceful steps. My heart steady, my expression unreadable. The girl they had thrown away was now standing at the center of a world they could only dream of. And then Noah stepped beside me. Ryan's shock deepened as he took in the man standing at my side. The man I was about to marry. Noah, my partner in business, in life. The man who had built an empire with me from the ground up. The man who had helped me become untouchable. He placed a steady hand on my waist and kissed my temple softly before turning to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice rich with confidence. "It is our honor to welcome you to our wedding." Ryan and Olivia were frozen in place. It was as if their world had just collapsed all over again. "She's marrying him?" Olivia stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan clenched his fists, his breathing uneven. He had spent the last few years desperately trying to rebuild his life, trying to regain his status, his power. And now, the woman they had once dismissed as irrelevant, the woman his in-laws had discarded like an inconvenience, was standing at the top of an empire he had lost. And worse? He had no control over it. No second chances. No way to take back what had already been done. I made my way toward them, a glass of champagne in hand. I let them stew in their own silence, let the weight of reality settle over them. Then finally, I smiled. "Ryan," I said smoothly, tilting my head. "Olivia." Ryan swallowed hard. Olivia's fingers curled around his wrist, her nails digging into his skin. Ryan's voice cracked slightly. "I had no idea." "No, you didn't," I said simply, taking a slow sip of my drink. "You never did." The words lingered, heavy with unspoken meaning. I let my gaze sweep over them, taking in their desperate eyes. The fragile way Olivia clung to him. The sheer disbelief written all over their faces. They had expected to come here as guests. Instead, they were spectators. Outsiders. Watching me. Watching what they had lost. Ryan swallowed his pride, his voice low and hesitant. "Emma," he began, as if searching for something to say, as if there was anything he could say that would change the past. I gave him a gentle smile, one that held no warmth, no softness. "Relax," I murmured. "I didn't do this for revenge." His brow furrowed. I let out a soft chuckle. "Do you really think I would waste my energy on you?" A flicker of something, humiliation, maybe even regret, crossed his face. I leaned in slightly, just enough so he could hear me over the music. "I didn't do this to ruin you," I whispered. "I did this because I never needed you. Any of you. And that? That was the real power move. Not destroying them. Not rubbing my success in their faces. But simply walking away." Noah stepped beside me again, his hand finding mine with effortless familiarity. "Ready?" he murmured. I nodded. We turned, walking toward the grand hall where our celebration was waiting, where real friends, real family, real love were waiting. I didn't look back. They had lost the right to matter to me a long time ago, and I had a future to step into. A future without them. For a long, stretched-out moment, they froze, as if their minds were refusing to process what they were seeing. Ryan's face, his confident posture unraveling into something unsteady, his mouth parted slightly, but no words came out at first. Emma, he finally choked out, his voice thick with disbelief. Across from him, my parents stood rooted to the spot, their eyes wide, their expressions frozen in a mixture of confusion and terror. My mother clutched my father's arm as if needing support to stay upright. But it was Olivia's reaction that satisfied me the most. She looked absolutely gutted, her hands trembling at her sides, and for once in her life, she had nothing to say. The perfect untouchable life she had built was cracking apart right in front of her. I smiled, calm, unshaken, powerful. Surprised to see me? Silence. Then my father, who had always spoken to me in orders, in condescending sighs, in sharp, clipped words, finally found his voice. This isn't possible, he muttered, shaking his head as if that would make the reality of my existence disappear. I tilted my head. Why not? His throat bobbed. Because we. He stopped himself, but I knew what he was about to say. Because we left you behind. Because we erased you from our lives. Because you weren't supposed to come back. My mother took a shaky step forward, her voice desperate. Emma, honey. I cut her off before she could spew any more lies. You don't get to honey me, Mom. You made it clear I was never part of this family. I watched the words hit her like a bullet. She flinched, her mouth opening and closing, struggling to find a way to justify the years of silence, the abandonment, the betrayal. Olivia's nails dug into her palm as she finally snapped out of her daze. This has to be some kind of joke, she spat. You're lying. You can't be the one who bought Ryan's company. I met her gaze with a slow, confident smirk. Can I? She took a step back, as if the truth physically burned her. You were nothing. The words came out before she could stop them, before she could soften them with fake affection, and that was all I needed to hear. I had always known it, always felt it in the way they treated me, the way they discarded me. But hearing it? It was freeing. I let my smile widen. And yet, here we are, you standing in ruins, and me. I swept my arms around the opulent venue. Standing at the top. Ryan took a slow, unsteady step forward. His voice shook. Emma, listen. I raised a hand. Don't. His mouth snapped shut. I exhaled, tilting my head as I studied him. The man I once thought was untouchable. The man my parents had sacrificed me for. Now, he just looked small. You don't get to rewrite history. None of you do. My voice remained smooth, even, unbreakable. My parents, Ryan, Olivia. They all wore the same expression. One I'd memorized years ago, panic. Panic that I was no longer under their control. Panic that their power over me had vanished. Panic that they had thrown away the wrong daughter. My father was the first to break. He let out a shaky, nervous chuckle, a weak attempt at regaining control. Well, he said, adjusting his tie. I suppose we were all young and foolish back then, weren't we? But family is family, Emma. Surely, we can put the past behind us. I let out a soft laugh, shaking my head. They were predictable, always manipulating, always pretending they weren't sorry. They weren't even ashamed. They were just afraid. I leaned in slightly, my voice dropping to something sharper, colder. You don't get to crawl back into my life just because it's convenient for you now. My father stiffened. My mother's lower lip trembled. Olivia's nostrils flared with rage. Olivia's voice was strained with desperation. Emma, I turned my gaze to her, waiting, letting her feel the weight of my silence. I never meant to hurt you. I blinked. The audacity, I said softly. Did you? Then tell me, Olivia, what exactly did you mean to do when you let my parents throw me away like I was worthless? She had no answer. I let the silence stretch between us before leaning back and letting out a breath. This isn't about revenge, I said finally, my voice lighter now, almost amused. Ryan and Olivia stared at me, confused. I laughed. If I wanted revenge, don't you think I would have let you suffer? Let you lose everything without a way to rebuild? My father's brows furrowed. Then what do you want? I took a slow sip of my champagne, then gave them a smile so sharp it could cut. Nothing. I watched the truth crush them. I didn't want their apology. I didn't want their regret. I didn't want them at all. I took Noah's hand, his touch warm, steady, real, so unlike the people I was leaving behind. I met my father's gaze one last time. You all made your choice years ago. I turned to Olivia. Live with it. And with that, I walked away. This time, for good. For the first time in my life, I had control. And they hated it. Ryan, Olivia, and my parents all stood before me, scrambling for excuses, clinging to whatever shred of dignity they had left. But the truth was right there, choking them, leaving them breathless. They had thrown me away, and now I was the one who held all the power. My mother was the first to break. Her voice trembling with forced emotion. "Emma, we were just trying to do what was best for you." I arched an eyebrow, crossing my arms. "Best for me?" I repeated, tilting my head. "That's interesting, because if I remember correctly, you never once asked me what I wanted." My father cleared his throat, his expression tight. "We missed you, Emma. We always thought about you." "We?" I laughed, shaking my head. They really thought I was that gullible. "You missed me?" My voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. "Funny. I don't recall a single phone call. Not a single letter. Not one check-in to see if I was even alive." They flinched. Olivia let out a frustrated breath, crossing her arms like a petulant child. "You have to understand. I needed them. I was planning a wedding. I had responsibilities." I blinked at her, and that somehow meant I didn't. I let out a short, humorless laugh. I had to work multiple jobs just to survive. I had to fight for everything I have today. Meanwhile, you were too busy picking out wedding decorations to even wonder where I was. I took a step forward, watching as they shrank back, realizing maybe for the first time that they couldn't manipulate me anymore. "You didn't think about me once," I said, my voice quieter now, sharper, colder. "Not once. And now you expect me to believe you?" My father let out a shaky breath. "Emma, please." But there was nothing left to say because they knew it was true. Ryan finally spoke, stepping toward me cautiously, like I was something delicate that could break. "Emma," he said softly. "I know things were complicated back then, but I never wanted you to feel abandoned. I swear." "Stop," I cut him off, my tone flat. "You knew. You always knew. You just didn't care." He looked stricken. "That's not you." "I let them do it." I continued, stepping closer, forcing him to see the truth he had buried for years. "You knew exactly what was happening, and you went along with it because keeping my parents happy was easier than standing up for me." His silence was deafening, and that was all the confirmation I needed. Olivia's frustration boiled over. "So what now, Emma?" she snapped, her voice dripping with bitterness. "You just get to stand there and act like you're better than us? Like you didn't get lucky?" I turned my gaze on her. "Lucky?" I repeated, letting the word settle between us. Her jaw clenched, her eyes burning with resentment. "You got everything handed to you while I was struggling to hold my life together." I blinked. Was she serious? "You think I got everything handed to me?" I let out a short, sharp laugh. "I worked for this, Olivia. Every single thing I have, I built with my own two hands. I didn't have parents funding my life. I didn't have a rich fiancé to fall back on. I had nothing, and still, I made something of myself." Her face twisted with rage. "I deserved a good life." I tilted my head, studying her. "And I didn't?" She didn't have an answer because, in her world, I never mattered enough to deserve anything. My mother suddenly reached for my hand, her eyes glistening with tears. "Emma, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Let's just put all of this behind us. We're still family." I stared at her hands, clutching mine, and for a brief moment, I almost let myself feel something. Almost. But then I remembered. I remembered the nights I went to sleep hungry because my aunt couldn't afford much. I remembered working myself to the bone, trying to prove I was worth something. I remembered the feeling of being utterly alone, knowing that my own family had chosen to forget me. I pulled my hands away. "You don't get to say that now," I murmured. My mother's face crumbled. My father looked away, his lips pressed into a thin line. They had lost. Ryan swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "Emma, is there anything we can do to fix this?" I stared at them, at the people who had thrown me away without a second thought, at the man who had watched it happen and done nothing. And I smiled. "No," I said simply. They looked devastated, but I didn't care. Because this wasn't about revenge. It was about freedom. And I had never felt so free in my life.